Alrighty, hello and welcome to learning about 3.3, which is unfamiliar text. What I'm using is largely an old PowerPoint, so there are dogs and things like that throughout to try keep it interesting. So feel free to be and decide which learner dog you are today. I'm hoping you're all definitely the sausage dog with the glasses or the Rottweiler with the glasses who looks really enthused to be there. Next is another another slide with dogs on it. And finally, unfamiliar text. So level 3, it is same but different. So the point of this PowerPoint and this video is to go through those differences, go through what you should be looking at before you read the text, how to accurately read the text, and some language features or things that you should be looking for. It's predominantly me modeling those aspects, but there are things that you should be recording down as part of your notes. So the basic need to knows about it. It is different, but it is the same. So I thought I'd go through those things. So you have to answer 3 questions. That's the same, but this time it only involves 2 texts. So you will read 2 texts, but answer 3 questions. So normally you would read 3 texts and answer 3 questions. So it takes out one of those texts. So instead, what the third question focuses on is it's a comparative question about the 2 texts. So you compare and contrast the 2 texts and how they show something similar. So between the 2 texts, there will be a key or similar aspect. It will be shown in a different way. You have to reference 2 aspects of the text. So it's not specified as language features at level 3. It is called aspects. These are a vague term and it encompasses more than just the use of language. So it also comments on things like ideas, structures, audiences, and purposes. So by commenting on them, you are addressing an aspect. And I'll talk about that in a moment, why that is. The texts are a bit longer. They're a little bit more highbrow, and the poetry can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to understand. That's kind of up to you to figure out whether you think it's harder or not. But they're definitely longer texts, and the poems not necessarily longer, but with a bit more depth to them. The question doesn't ask you to describe and explain like level 1. It doesn't ask you to analyze like level 2. It asks you to discuss. So that's where that aspects thing comes in. It comes in with discussion and the next point. So you need to switch your mindset when looking at unfamiliar text as a search and find language feature kind of situation and more into a read and discuss. So you want to be looking a lot more at those ideas and those messages and how the language supports that. So language can be kind of a little bit restrictive when we think of it like that. So aspects, by thinking about language, definitely, but also ideas, construction, audience, and purpose, and syntax, and narrative point of view, and all those aspects are really important. So they want you to have a bit more of a discussion. The assumption is that by the end of year 13, you've got some maturity and you can go forward and discuss those concepts as well as the language used to support them rather than being purely language based. It's not just language analysis that you're after. So that's the basic needs to knows. So make sure you pause the video if required to copy down those key aspects. So the steps for success, I'm going to model these and then you'll have an opportunity to do them as well. But this is the stuff that you should be doing before you even read the text. Getting these elements down is really helpful, really good practice. And the more you do this, the easier it gets. So firstly, you want to look at the title of your text. If it matches the content, that's something you can talk about. If it doesn't match the content, it leads you down a different path. That is something you can talk about. Look at the descriptor. This is a really big key one. If you didn't go through this at level 2 or level 1, now's your time to really latch on to that. So as the texts become more difficult and longer, it's really important to read the text descriptor because it literally tells you what the text is about. So even if it's a little bit metaphoric, a little bit confusing, it can give you a bit more of a clue. Make predictions and connections. So this comes from looking at the title, looking at the descriptor, looking at the glossed words, looking at the information around it, looking at those things. If it mentions war or life or death, there are sort of comparisons and predictions and connections that you can already go through. The environment, what's the human impact, future, responsibility? Those bigger picture messages are really important. And you can make those predictions using literally just the title and the descriptor, and then often the glossed words are information at the bottom of the page, and then sometimes those keywords from the question can help as well. So making those predictions is really meaningful. When you think about it, there's a sort of finite number of topics that anyone can ever write about. There's possibly nature, there's like the human existence, which goes into like family, childhood, friendship, love, relationships. There is, well, those are the main two. And then there are big events like war, pollution, environmental impacts. So there are a certain extent of finite topics that you can really address. So if you start to already make predictions or lessons or assumptions about those things as part of your prep, when you see something and you go, oh, it's a nature one. What was that thing that I practiced about nature? Oh, yeah, something about man's relationship with nature, or how nature exists forever, or how we're ruining nature. There's always a certain amount of pre-work that you can do. That means that when you see these unfamiliar texts, you already know that there are some familiar concepts that you've considered beforehand. But make them. Once you start doing that, if you've prepped beforehand, you make those connections once you've read the title and read the descriptor. And if you haven't done those connections beforehand, you definitely start getting it whirring through, getting those process, those bigger picture concepts, those almost kind of cliched messages. That's going to help you. Read the question before you read the text. I always recommend this to give a more targeted approach. Some teachers will say different things, but this is my recommendation, is that you read the question, you kind of see where they want you to go with it before you read the text. Read the glossed words. So glossed words means words that the markers or the examiners think that you might need to know the meaning to. That's going to help you. And also at the bottom with the glossed words, if there are any, is all the textual information that will give you the release date of the text and also where it has appeared. This is really important, and I'll show you through why that is in a moment as well. And lastly, text type. Look to see if it looks like an opinion piece or a piece of fiction prose, non-fiction prose, if it's poetry. You get to know certain things about certain text types and certain language features that you can kind of expect are going to crop up. So they're really important. So those are things that I would definitely recommend before you even read the text per se that you're scanning, looking for, and getting that process going. Unfamiliar text can seem really scary to some people, but it's all about just knowing the tips and tricks to sort of get you over that and get your brain kind of processing in the way that it needs to be successful. So what I thought I would show you, and you can practice by looking at this on the screen or just follow along and listen and then take something from that. And then when you have to do this yourself, hopefully you'll be able to do it. So this is looking at the 2019 text. I can't get the full text, but that doesn't matter for this anyway. So it is a prose piece. It is a passage, so you know it is an extract. In this passage, rather, this is the extract. The writer discusses the issue of water quality in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the title is Troubled Waters. And the source, if you look down the bottom of the screen there, is adapted, which means it's an edited form of something by Warren Kennedy called Troubled Waters that appeared in the New Zealand Geographic in July-August edition of 2017. So if I was reading it, that's the stuff that I'd be looking for, and I'd be highlighting or underlining on my page. Personally, it works better for me to be able to make contact with a page when doing this, but you might be able to do it just by sight and association, but I benefit from that. So that's the key information that I'd be taking away from there. And I'll show you what that is going to be used for, or what I think it could be used for, without even reading the text in the next couple of slides. Then I'd look at the question before I read the text. So this is what the questions look like at level 3. Refer to text A, Troubled Waters, on page 2 of the resource booklet. Discuss the way the writer explores ongoing change, referring to at least 2 specific aspects of written text. Aspects may include, but are not limited to, figurative language, emotive language, symbolism, allusion, and rhetorical question. Now, this is a shift. If you go back to like 2017, 2016, you'll find that the aspects referenced there are much more broad and limited. They're things like diction, point of view, syntax, whereas here they're starting to provide more specific language features or terms or things to be aware of. So remember though, from that previous couple of slides back, aspects refers to language and figurative language, but also ideas and purpose and structure and so forth. Okay, so from there, I'd be looking at the ongoing change and I'd be thinking about change. It's already something that they want me to think about before I've even read the text. So when I start reading the text, I'm looking for that concept of change. I'm looking at those language features and they sort of spark ideas as well. So by reading there, before I've even read the text, I know I can look out for figurative language, which is things like metaphors and similes. Um, I can look out for allusions and emotive language and symbolism, and everyone loves a rhetorical question. So that's so handy that you already know that. So that's why it's really valid to do that. So what I want to take away from there is already explores ongoing change, issue of water quality, New Zealand in 2017. That's the information that I can take before I've even read the text. And then what I do want to do is practice my connections or associations with that. So you might be wondering what that might look like. So when I see those four things, dun, 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 these are the ideas that start to come up in my head. So I start to think about New Zealand being a developing nation. That's what I get with this ongoing change. We're not a nation necessarily with the longest, obviously, if we're looking colonialized based history, the longest history. We've got an identity that's associated with a clean green image and the fact that it's told me it was about water quality, New Zealand, and change. I'm thinking that's going to have something to do with it. That then makes me think about how that image might be false or a facade, and then how that might influence a developing identity. I thought this could link with global issues around pollution, and how, as a modern society, we're going through a lot of changes to becoming more environmentally aware. The fact that this appeared in a National Geographic equivalent also suggests that that might be something that's quite relevant. So that's all the stuff that I've already got going. So I've already got that going on in my head, and all I want to see is if the text shows that or doesn't show that. And if it doesn't, that's okay because I've read the text and I have to read it anyway. But if it does, then I've already started making those connections in my brain and it's going to be easier. Remember, you're working under a high stress, super time bound situation when you're doing unfamiliar text. Typically, you go for 20 minutes per text, including the writing. This time, you can go for maybe more like 25 because you don't have to read another text. You just have to answer 3 questions on 2 texts. But regardless, 5 minutes, 10 minutes extra, either way, depending on how you can cut your essays down, you're under a time press situation. So, any of those connections and associations that you can start to get going will be helpful. So there's an activity that you guys can do that links with this, but there's also a couple of more slides to go through. Cute dog interlude before we move into the next bit. So that's all the stuff that you can do before you've even read the text. I like the walrus the best. Now, when you're reading the text, skim and scan. It's going to have to be a quick read, and you're going to have to get used to quick reading. Some people do this better than others. It's a skill. It's a skill that comes from doing more and more of it. The better you get at this comes from practicing it. So when you get unfamiliar text booklets, practicing how long it takes you to read through a text, seeing if you can cut that down. If you find a newspaper or a magazine, how good can you get at getting the general idea? If you don't know how to do any of this stuff, it sounds juvenile, but go back and research online how to do it. There's lots of this taught in primary schools, but it might not be taught when you were there. Find primary school resources. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So you've got to be quick. Do a general read. You can go back and do another deep dive if you need to, but you want to know what you're dealing with straight away. And that helps with those connections as well. I'm a big fan of getting the text and breaking them into chunks. So looking at first, second, and third parts of the text, or if it breaks into 4, how it breaks up. So what you'll see is that the text divides into different focuses. When people write, they write with different developments. This helps me look at how the text is developed or crafted. It also allows me to go for a better focus. Sometimes looking at a whole text, and you'll see the size of the text eventually, it can be quite overwhelming. So if I break it up into chunks, even if they don't have the same idea, or I can't see that they've got different ideas or whatever, still just breaking it up helps make it more manageable. That was something I was taught in A level and it stuck with me. It's not a wall of text and it is a lot easier. When you can look at development, that's going to help as well. So it works on a number of levels to help you. Annotate. So with time being poor, you don't necessarily have to annotate the whole language feature, but circling it and putting an abbreviation next to it so that when you get writing and you come back to it, it helps. You've read the question, so you already know what you're looking for to an extent, and words will stand out to you. So diction is word choice. You don't just want diction, you want it to have an adjective in front of it, emotive diction, negative diction, positive diction. It's there for you, but you want to be able to find words that they'll stand out for a reason, or a sentence will stand out, and you might not be able to think about the language features straight away, but circling, underlining, highlighting, that will help you on your merry way for sure. And finally, I think this is finally, I've got images of certain things at certain points to remind me if I'm finished or not. So finally, I think there are certain language features or aspects that regardless of what the text is, you're going to be able to talk about them. So getting familiar with these and getting used to talking about these is really handy, because sometimes you can't find the metaphor or the simile, or you find it but you don't know what it means. So learning these things, getting used to talking about them, practicing talking about them, is always going to prove really beneficial. The title. Um, does it lead you down the garden path, which means does it not make sense with the content, or does it perfectly match? Is it a pun that sets the tone? Does it have a metaphor or imagery already going? Titles are good. And you can talk about them in the sense that you can say, from the title alone, we are led to believe, or the writer sets the tone straight from the title. And that shows that you've got an awareness that the whole text is being pieced together. Punctuation. This is incredibly important, particularly for poetry. Is there lots of it? Lots of punctuation means lots of pauses, and that impacts the flow of the sentences. In a poem, it's called enjambment, which is a language feature, and that refers to poetry that flows across sentences. It can show a rushed feeling, it can show a dreamy sort of effect, and it impacts the structure of a text. So punctuation, always there. If it's not there, you talk about it. If it is there, you can talk about it. Rhetorical questions come under that. Questions, exclamations, dialogue is shown through plenty of speech marks or quotation marks. So punctuation is super handy. Get used to trying to find it. Get to know it. Structure. Does it flip between different people? Does it have lots of short paragraphs? Big, long paragraphs? If it's a poem, does it have rhyme or rhythm? Do we get to see two different perspectives? Does it chop and change? Does it stay and then suddenly in the last paragraph it's completely different? That's all stuff you can talk about. Structure is quite tricky. Don't necessarily believe that everyone can find it and talk about it confidently, but if you can see it or you're starting to develop that, it's important. Sentence structure. Long sentences, short sentences, lots of short sentences, one short sentence after a really, really long sentence, length of stanzas in poetry. It's all about trying to think on your feet, and sometimes under high pressure situations, you can't find certain language features. Sentence structure counts as an aspect. Go for it. Parts of speech, this is if you're only really, really stuck. Personal pronouns, lots of me, my, we, our. Are they talking about inclusive pronouns to include the audience? Parts of speech links in with the next bit as well. Lots of verbs mean lots of actions. Lots of adjectives means lots of description. That's if things are getting dire, you can probably get there. And lastly, narrative perspective. So this comes, you can figure that out through the use of personal pronouns, I, me, my, or he, she, and so forth. Narrative perspective, it will generally be first or third. However, the elusive second person narrative perspective does exist. Does it make you connected to the text? Do you feel like you're watching the text? How does that impact your understanding of it? How does it impact how you experience the text? How does that impact how the message or theme comes about? Do we feel judged? Do we feel urged? Do we feel like we relate to the text? How does the narrative perspective do that? So definitely one that you can drop in there. So these language features go alongside all the classics like metaphor and simile and allusion and symbolism and emotive language and hyperbole and all those others. Absolutely. And you want to know those others. But if things get dire, don't forget these ones exist as well. So you can go forth and read your text or read the beginnings and ends and questions before you read the text. When you read on it, annotate it, highlight it, reflect on the content, put the topic keywords at the top of your page to focus your reading. So that's where you go back and look at the question. Break it into chunks, make it easier to manage, look for changes in the text, identify tone and ideas, and have a think about the purpose from the moment you read it. What does the writer want me to get? That purpose links to the bigger picture message, which is ultimately what every marker wants you to do. I think this is it. There we go. That's it for the first video. Hopefully this helps with an introduction to 3.3. Thank you.